Thanks, Ian, and it's great to be back at the GMF. I was reminiscing backstage with Ian that we've known each other for 28 years. At that time, we both had more hair, and people were still talking about crises in the transatlantic relations. So some things have changed and some things haven't changed. But it's good to be back here in Brussels. This is the first European stop I'm making as U.S. Trade Representative. And it doesn't seem so long ago that my wife, Nancy, and I were here as law students, camped out in the lobby of the Berlaymont with a phone book, making cold calls to various offices, trying to get somebody to hire us as stagiaires, which they ultimately did. And she went on to work at DG Competition, and I worked at what was then called the Forward Studies Unit, which I understand is now the Bureau of European Policy Advisors. But it was a wonderful opportunity to get to know the European community and its institutions from the inside. That was decades ago, and many things have changed, but many things remain the same. Transatlantic cooperation remains the foundation of global peace and security. Our devotion to democratic ideals serves as the beacon for the world to follow, and our shared commitment to free markets is a driving force for economic growth, innovation, and jobs, not just in Europe and the United States, but around the world. Over the course of the past 6 decades, the U.S. and Europe have been partners shaping the international economic system. From the ruins of war, we work to create strong rules and institutions to govern international trade, investment, and finance. And these rules and institutions laid the groundwork for generations to enjoy global stability and unprecedented prosperity. In 1948, the U.S. and the European nations made up over 1/3 of the members of the GATT, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization. We were motivated by a shared belief that trade liberalization, rather than protectionism, would catalyze growth and rebuild a shattered world economy. In the intervening 65 years, our economic partnership has deepened in almost every measure. Today, the U.S. and European Union are each other's largest economic partners, with $2.6 billion worth of goods and services flowing between us each day. We invest nearly $4 trillion in each other's economies, creating the world's largest investment relationship. And more than 13 million people owe their jobs to the transatlantic economic relationship. The U.S.-EU economic partnership is second to none. But we know that we can do more. We can do more for economic growth. We can do more to create jobs. We can do more to strengthen rules-based trade that supports the entire global trading system. And that's precisely why we launched the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. Together with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and the work being done at the WTO to negotiate a multilateral trade facilitation agreement, a plurilateral trade and services agreement, and an expansion of the information technology agreement, we see TTIP as an opportunity to raise the standards, to introduce new disciplines, and ultimately to strengthen the multilateral trading system. Our goals for TTIP are clear. A successful negotiation will create a comprehensive agreement, which not only opens markets, but ties us closer together. Not only enhances our mutual commitment to rules-based trade, but empowers us and enhances our ability to strengthen the rules-based system around the world, including around issues such as localization and the role of state-owned enterprises. This is in itself an ambitious agenda, but the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge of TTIP is in the area of regulation and standards, and that's what I wanted to focus on today. First, let me be clear. There is nothing we seek to do through TTIP to undermine the determinations that each of our systems have made with regard to the appropriate level of health, safety, and environmental protection of our people. When we talk about regulations and standards, we're talking about how to bridge the divergences between two well-regulated markets, not about launching a broad deregulatory agenda. We're focused on reducing unnecessary costs that damage our collective competitiveness in an increasingly competitive global economy, perhaps resulting in what my former colleague, Cass Sunstein, has called simpler regulation. The U.S. and European regulatory systems are the most advanced in the world. On both sides of the Atlantic, our citizens know that their drinking water is clean. Our environmental protections are the strongest in the world. When Americans and Europeans get behind the wheel of a car or board an airplane, They know regulators have worked with manufacturers to ensure that they are traveling in greater safety than ever before. This is our strength, and TTIP will build on our shared commitment to strong regulations in the public interest. We have a long history of cooperation on important regulatory issues. Americans and Europeans have concluded an equivalence agreement on organic food. We've cooperated on smart grid interoperability standards and implemented mutual recognition of testing and certification of telecommunications equipment. And yet, there is much more to do. Each of our systems achieves largely comparable levels of protection in many areas, but we don't always agree on how to define and recognize the equivalence among regulations. Each of our aviation regulators has found a way to trust each other's safety inspections, but that has not spilled over into other sectors. In certain sectors, a product built in the United States, even to an EU standard, cannot be tested in the United States against that standard, but can only be certified in Europe. Our standard-setting bodies include the participation of companies from Europe and around the world. Yet the only bodies the EU recognizes as producing international standards are those in which the EU member states cast the bulk of the votes. These are but a few examples. Over decades, differences in our regulatory and standards approaches have created unnecessary barriers, raising costs, deterring trade and investment, and negatively impacting our competitiveness and our consumers. As traditional barriers like tariffs and duties have decreased, these standards and regulatory issues have emerged as the greatest potential impediment to further integration of the world's two largest markets. These differences in our approach to regulation and standards have also inhibited our ability to present a shared vision to other countries and to agree on global rules. Finding new ways to address these issues is perhaps the greatest contribution that TTIP can make to our long-term growth and competitiveness. Now, much of the work in this area, as we know from the Transatlantic Economic Council, is mind-blowingly technical. But there are certain cross-cutting principles and processes that can contribute significantly, and I'll just focus on three: transparency, participation, and accountability. Transparency, providing adequate advance notice of specific regulatory measures, not just preliminary general papers on the subject, but the actual rule being proposed. Participation, providing meaningful opportunities for input from a broad range of stakeholders, public and private, foreign and domestic. Accountability, providing responses to that input, a rationale for the final regulatory decision based on evidence, science, including an impact analysis of the proposed regulation. In the United States, we maintain transparency by publishing an agenda of upcoming regulations twice a year. Later, we publish the text of proposed regulations in the Federal Register. We flag proposed rules that have potential implications for international trade so that our trading partners can focus on those regulations. And we make sure that any underlying regulatory impact assessments are available on a single online portal with enough time and notice for all stakeholders from anywhere in the world to provide input. This is especially important for small and medium-sized enterprises, which can't necessarily afford to weigh in on these issues in person in Washington or Brussels, or hire consultants to do so on their behalf. If notice of a regulation under consideration comes too late, only once it has been transmitted, or when regulators are no longer in a position to revise their proposal, there might be the illusion of inclusion, but not meaningful participation. Our law requires that we tie this transparency to accountability, requiring us to explain how we considered the comments received and any changes we made to the proposed regulation. This approach not only respects the democratic principles upon which our laws are built, but allows us to obtain valuable information from a range of affected interests, ensuring better quality regulations that can save our economy billions of dollars annually. And for our trading partners, having had the chance to participate in our rulemaking process and knowing how their participation had an impact, they are not surprised by the time new regulations are adopted in final. And as a result, potential trade frictions can be resolved ahead of time. Transparency, participation, accountability, these are core to the U.S. regulatory system, but they are not uniquely American principles. These aspirations are evident across Europe as well. More than a decade ago, the EU published a white paper proposing, and I quote, "opening up the policymaking process to get more people and organizations involved, by promoting greater openness and accountability and responsibility in EU policies. Around the same time, the EU issued minimum standards for consultation, stating that the Commission should consult widely before proposing legislation and, wherever appropriate, publish consultation documents. And a number of your member states and parts of the Commission already use similar open and accountable processes. Indeed, global regulatory practice, good regulatory practice, is a focus globally. The OECD calls transparency one of the central pillars of effective regulation. The World Bank states that transparency and accountability is vital to market confidence in a modern regulatory state. Now, there's no one-size-fits-all to good regulatory practice. The relationship between the executive and Congress in the United States is different than the relationships among the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament, not to mention the member states. But TTIP can be an important opportunity to explore what we can do jointly to fulfill these principles. We firmly believe that if we succeed in embedding these principles, we'll produce better regulations and mitigate many of the tensions we face around regulatory divergences. And I sense that there'll be a lot of support for this on both sides of the Atlantic. I hear regularly from U.S. companies and associations about wanting to be more involved in the EU process of developing regulatory measures. And I also hear from Europeans, from European businesses and other stakeholders, including NGOs, labor, civil society. I hear from member states and members of the European Parliament, all of whom are looking for greater transparency, participation, and accountability. And I believe we can overcome these challenges together, addressing them concretely and unequivocally in TTIP. Now, there's a similar set of issues around the setting of standards. Stakeholders should have equal access to the standard setting process, regardless of nationality. Instead of their passports, it should be their professional expertise and judgment that should open the door to participation on how technical issues are decided, implemented, and certified. Restricting standards development to nationality-based processes is a tempting way to carve out market share for national constituencies, but the costs are too high, not just for trading partners, but for standard setters and regulators forced too often to leave cutting-edge technical solutions out in the cold. There might have been an age when we could afford such costs, but at a time when we are focused on both sides of the Atlantic on growth, innovation, and competitiveness, and when the US and EU have shared concerns about third countries' use of standards to divide markets rather than integrate them, TTIP should be an opportunity to set a high standard for global standard setting, to unleash our collective creativity and encourage good practices around the world. We need to admit the government regulatory experts, be they in Brussels or Washington, do not have a monopoly on good ideas and expertise. Many private sector actors are ahead of the curve with cutting-edge ideas, and the speed at which standards are being set by the market is far greater than most bureaucratic or intergovernmental bodies can move. We've seen this in the incredibly innovative area of information technology, where ultimately the need for interoperable standards encouraged the EU to join the US in working with private sector-led standards. But in other areas, an inability to incorporate the best ideas from market-driven standard-setting processes has discouraged innovation and interoperability, increased cost, and reduced competitiveness. Neither Europe nor the US can afford to leave good ideas on the table. Gone are the days when we could take comfort in national standards or European standards or even international standards divorced from the market. Our goal should be to move standardization towards new, open global horizons and create an environment in which our companies can succeed worldwide. Together, we want to collaborate in the development of global standards, not simply be standard takers. We see this as critical to our capacity to create jobs, promote growth, and improve the standards of living of people here at home. There are a number of challenges to achieving our objectives in TTIP. One that is often cited is our historical difference about the appropriate approach to regulation, sometimes characterized as a so-called gap between Europe's preference for the precautionary principle and the United States' focus on cost-benefit analysis. I believe that concern is largely anachronistic. It's a caricature to suggest that Europe only takes regulatory action based on the precautionary principle. In other words, without 100% scientific certainty that it prohibits an activity. Since science is rarely definitive, under this scenario, all productive activity would cease. And similarly, it's a caricature to suggest that the U.S. bases its regulations solely on cost-benefit analysis, and that it does not take qualitative factors into consideration, such as dignity, fairness, and equity. For example, when the American with Disabilities Act was being implemented, the decision to require accessible bathrooms wasn't simply a matter of cost-benefit analysis. It reflected a sense of equity and dignity as well. And so while it might be premature to declare an end to the debate between the precautionary principle and cost-benefit analysis, the distinction is decreasingly important, at least in terms of the work we have before us in TTIP. Addressing these many regulatory and standards issues won't be easy, but we know from experience that few things worth doing are easy. We both have successes under our belts that we can be proud of. 2 years ago, the Obama administration mandated a rigorous review and cost-benefit analysis of existing rules and regulations, a labor-intensive, tedious, and unpopular process. It also yielded billions of dollars of savings by eliminating unnecessary rules and regulations and fostering critical reforms. And most importantly, these cost savings did not in any way minimize the high standards of protection we expect our regulations and rules to deliver. I'll give you just one example. Since the 1970s, the EPA had defined milk as oil, meaning dairy farmers were subjected to costly requirements designed to prevent oil spills. Although common sense would tell us that the two should be treated differently, this had persisted for decades. As part of the administration's review process, the Environmental Protection Agency exempted milk from these rules, with 5-year savings expected to top $700 million. Now, here in the EU has managed to secure efficiencies through the high-level group on administrative burdens, and of course, through the creation of the single European market itself, which was far more difficult and ambitious a task. We can draw inspiration from the difficult work we have both accomplished, all the while being driven by the imperative and responsibility to do everything we can to create jobs and growth in the United States and Europe. Doing so will strengthen our competitiveness, our ability to innovate, and our capacity to work with the rest of the world to strengthen the global trading system, and we look forward to that challenge. Thanks very much.